Hello, I am Bhikkhu Pamutto, and I am here with the Indonesian Buddhist family in Queens, New York, at the Vihara Parivara Dhamma Acala. And I'd like to speak a little bit about the Dhamma, because this is something we take refuge in. It's something that's very important to Buddhists. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the Dhamma in the simple worldly sense, like what does Dhamma mean in terms of the Buddhist religion, and then I'd like to speak in the more profound sense of what the Buddha was actually pointing to when he said Dhamma. And so every major religion that you can point to has some kind of book or holy book, and Buddhism is no different. In fact, we have a lot of books. And this is just one of a set of over 20 books of an English translation of the Pali Canon. And so first you have three major Buddhist traditions, and each one has a different set of books. What the books in Buddhism contain is they contain the teachings of the Buddha and his disciples explaining the Dhamma. And in the Theravada, we have what is called the Pali Canon. And it is called the Pali Canon because it is preserved in a language called Pali, which actually wasn't called Pali when it was first spoken. It was called Magadhan, and it was in the country of Magadha in central India, where the Buddha first attained enlightenment and where he first taught. And so a few hundred years after the Buddha's parinirvana, the teaching that was being recorded, Magadha became a very important and powerful country run by King Asoka. And so that's when they started to call it Pali, because it wasn't long after Magadha came to prominence that they began to write these teachings down because they were worried about losing them. So that's when it became Pali, and Pali means text. So that's when it actually became books. Before that, the Dhamma was just spoken. And so most of what we have in the Pali Canon was spoken and memorized for centuries before it was actually written down and became text. So in this way, if people ask, you say, well, we don't have just one holy book, because the Dhamma is not like that. The Dhamma is a collection of teachings, and we have many of these recorded. In the Pali Canon, we have a set, and in the Chinese Agamas, they have a set. And in the Vajrayana, the Tibetan Tantras, they have another set. And so anywhere where beings have woken up to the Dhamma, where they have become enlightened and people have taught the Dhamma to each other, there's a set of teachings that can be recorded. But I'd like to just focus on the Pali Canon for a minute, because this is very important to Theravada Buddhists. And the Pali Canon is divided into three major sections. And one section is the Vinaya. And this is about 6 books. It's about twice the size of this in the English. And these books deal specifically with the rules and the stories behind the rules for Buddhist monks. So for bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. And that's all that section is about. The second section is the suttas, and that's all the Dhamma teachings and the stories, and like the Dhammapada, the little verses that are Dhamma teachings in brief. So most of what we really treasure and we remember as the words of the Buddha is in the suttas. And then the final section is the Abhidhamma. And the Abhidhamma was starting to be developed at the time of the Buddha, but mostly it came together afterwards. it was after there were many, many monks and many scholars, and they had already decided on what the suttas were. They began to try to devise systems of understanding the world. And the Abhidhamma is a very philosophical approach, or a very analytical approach. It means it's almost mathematical. It tries to have a lot of logic and precision, which some people really like, and some people really don't like, because our lives are not that precise. When we try to talk about what's going on in the mind, we can, if we have really powerful samadhi, we can see things happen one after the other. But most of the time in our daily lives, things kind of run together, and we describe things in a more broad and general way. And so the Abhidhamma is not for everybody. But what's really what we really look at is the suttas. And these are the main texts in Buddhism. These are the main teachings. And so if somebody asks you what the Buddha teaches, you would probably think to something like the Four Noble Truths, which is found in the suttas. Or you would think to the Noble Eightfold Path. Or you'd think to the 7 Factors of Enlightenment. Or you would talk about the 4 Brahma Viharas. Or any of a number of teachings that the Buddha gave, or that have been given by his disciples. And those are all in the suttas. And the sutta section of the Pali Canon is broken down into 5 collections, or baskets. And one of these is called the Connected Discourses, the Samyutta Nikaya. And this is broken up by theme. And so there's a samyutta, or a set of connected discourses where the Buddha was talking to devas, or celestial beings. And then there's another where the Buddha was talking about the 5 sense bases, or the 6 sense bases, rather. So the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. There's another where the Buddha talks only about the 4 Noble Truths. There's even a samyutta of all the teachings given by Sariputta. Another about teachings given by Anuruddha. So it's not just the Buddha in the Pali Canon. And that's the Samyutta Nikaya. The next Nikaya I can talk about is the Anguttara, or the numbered discourses. And this is very easy to find your place in, because the whole thing is just teachings that are designed around numbered lists. So you have the Book of the Ones, and it's all the times that the Buddha said, one thing, bhikkhus, if cultivated, or if you find one thing in the world, or this is the best of all things, this one thing. Anytime he gave a teaching that was based around the number 1, it's recorded there in the Anguttara, Book of the Ones. And then you have a Book of the Twos, and a Book of the Threes, and a Book of the Fours. And that's the numbered discourses. Then you have 2 more sets, the middle-length discourses and the long discourses. And these deal with teachings that are just a few pages in length, so middle length, and then teachings that are very long. Some of them are 30 or 40 pages of text. These are very important teachings, and they include most of what is taught when one really wants to get a deep understanding of the Buddhist teachings. The middle length teachings tend to focus on what practice is like. They're very good for looking at the life of monastics and of Dhamma practitioners, and understanding what Dhamma practice looks like from the beginning all the way to the end, and how you do it. And the long discourses tend to have a lot of narrative, or a lot of story to them. And they include a lot of the material that's in the middle-length discourses, but they also have some fables. And they have discussions about what teachers were talking about in the Buddhist time, and how the Buddha pointed to the way they were looking at things didn't match with the way things really are. And finally, there's a section of the suttas called the Khuddaka, or short teachings, which is actually a miscellaneous collection, and it involves everything else in the Sutta Pitaka, in the discourses. And the Khuddaka, or the short collection, includes works like the Dhammapada, or the Itivuttaka, or the Udanas. It includes the Therigatha and the Therigatha, and these are poems of the enlightened monks and nuns. There's the stories of ghosts and stories of heavenly beings. There's the Jatakas, or the stories of the Buddha's previous lives before he was enlightened and became the Buddha. And so there's a lot of really interesting material, and most of it tends to be very short and not have a lot of narrative. In fact, some of them are just verses, and they don't have much narrative at all. So what came about after the Buddhist time is something that is sometimes attached to the suttas, or sometimes is separate but references the suttas. And this is we call these the commentaries, or the Attakatas. And the Attakatas are try to explain things that don't have enough explanation in the suttas themselves. And so if ever you see little notes when you're reading a sutta, and you go to the back of the book and it explains something, that's coming from the commentaries. And the commentaries came after the Buddhist time, but it's based on a lot of tradition, so that's where we begin to see not just the simple teachings, but how they've been interpreted for many, many centuries. And that is the Pali Canon, all of these texts. And you can probably see that there's something for everybody. If you're willing to look, you might find a part of this collection that really speaks to you and that helps you to understand. But why is it we have so many books when Judaism or Islam or Christianity, when many other religions will only have one book? And that's because the Dhamma that the Buddha pointed to isn't just one thing. It isn't a teaching that comes from a God, and it isn't a teaching that can be summed up in just one way. Because the Dhamma is something that we each need to wake up to for ourselves. And so after the Buddha woke up to the Dhamma, after the Buddha attained enlightenment, the Dhamma was something different based on the people he was teaching. So he adjusted the way he was teaching based on the person he was teaching to. And we're very lucky. In Christianity, Jesus came back to Palestine and he began teaching, and he was only able to teach for 2 years or so before he died, before he was killed. But the Buddha had 45 years after his enlightenment to teach to his disciples, and he created a large community of bhikkhus and a large community of bhikkhunis and a large community of men and women lay disciples that when he passed away were enlightened or had stages of enlightenment and were able to transmit his teachings to future generations. So we got a large treasure chest full of teachings that have been passed down, and people who learned from the Buddha had so much gratitude for what he taught them that they continued to pass down his words, which we consider to be some of the best and the most precise teachings on Dhamma. And what the Dhamma is, though, is not necessarily what's in the books, because again, these were given to different people at different times. But all the stuff in the books point to the Dhamma. When we take refuge in the Dhamma, We have different ways, epithets of the Dhamma that we recite. We say that the Dhamma is sanditiko, akaliko, ehipassiko, opanayiko. And we say pachatang veditabo vinyuhi. And these mean that the Dhamma is visible here and now, that it is timeless. It isn't limited to just one time in history, that it encourages us to come and see, and that it's progressive. It leads us onward. It gets deeper. Finally, the Dhamma is for each person to understand for themselves. And when we recite these qualities of the Dhamma, we're remembering that what's in the books points us to the Dhamma. It points us to an awakening of what's right here and right now in front of us. And that the Dhamma develops qualities in our hearts. It makes us better people. It makes us better able to understand the world around us. And this is what waking up to the Dhamma does. And this is not something that happens just at once. There are stories of people in the Buddhist time who were already practicing meditation and who already had really good sila. So when the Buddha gave them a teaching, wow, they woke up really quick and they understood very quickly. But now for most of us in the current day, it will take some time to develop these qualities. And so that's why we say opanayiko, that's why we say it leads onwards, is because we start out and we don't know anything about the Buddha's teachings. And maybe we have a lot of qualities that we wish we could do better about. We wish we could not get angry all the time or not be so greedy. But when we start to hear the Dhamma, then we start to understand what is good and what is bad, and what we should try to let go of, and what we should try to develop. So the Dhamma points us in the right direction, and then we know what to practice, what to get better at. And as we do practice that Dhamma, we begin to understand it for ourselves. So when we first hear a Dhamma teaching, it's the best we can do is to try to repeat the teaching as clearly and as accurately as we can, because wise people will be able to understand that teaching no matter who recites it. And this is one of the reasons why we chant. We are reciting the Dhamma, we are recollecting it, we are going over it again and again and again in a way that people in the future will be able to understand and hear the same words of the Buddha that we received from previous generations. But after a time, when we've been practicing the Dhamma for some time, it begins to work itself into us. We wake up to pieces of the Dhamma. We begin to understand and see how the world works. And at that time, the Dhamma is not just what's in the books. At that time, the Dhamma is inside of us. And when we speak, we're starting to speak on the Dhamma. And so like giving this talk, when I first came to the monastery, I didn't know anything about Buddhism, except you should try to be kind and you should try to be generous. And that was a good start. And if you do just that, you will begin to develop. But as I listened to Dhamma teachings, and as I read the suttas, and as I practiced meditation, I began to understand for myself. And then one day, I found that people were asking me questions. And then later they were asking me to give talks like this. And that is the progression of the Dhamma. And this is why it's so special. So in Buddhism, it's not just the Buddha who woke up. It's all of us that can wake up. And when we wake up, it's something that we can give to others. The Dhamma is the foremost of gifts that we can give. We can help people after us understand the world better and wake up to the truth of the way things are. So the Dhamma is sometimes compared to a candle flame, in the same way that you might light a candle and then touch the flame of that candle to an unlit candle, and that candle will light. now you have 2 candles that are lit. And when you do this, the first candle flame doesn't become less. It still burns in the exact same way. And this is like the transmission of the Dhamma through the ages. It's like the lighting of candles on and on and on. The original understanding that we get doesn't change when we give the Dhamma to others. It is inexhaustible. So once we understand the Dhamma, everything that we do and say and think will be affected. And that way we can teach the Dhamma simply by existing. And this is part of what we take refuge in. We take refuge in the fact that we can wake up ourselves and become better people, and that is one of the best things that we can do for the world around us. So this is a little reflection. I hope it's been informative. I hope you understand a bit better about the structure of the Pali Canon and where you can look for different Dhamma teachings, but also give a sense of when you can put the books down and just study your own experience for a while and try to understand what it is you've been reading or what you've been hearing Dhamma talks about. So I wish you well.